This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I have a very dense episode for you guys this week. I'm going to be reviewing the main arguments of a book by the legend F.A. Hayek. This book is The Counter-Revolution of Science, and it is one of the most important books that I have read in the last year. Now, this is a work of philosophical history. It tries to trace the rise of socialist ideas and how those led to totalitarianism. And so this book is very, very thick and very, very dense. And I'm going to be reading from a lot of the notes that I took on this book today. So I realize that these kinds of episodes are not for everyone. This is one that we're definitely going to have to think through and really work through some of the arguments that Hayek makes. But this book is so important, and it's very difficult to find a copy of it. And I just thought that you guys need to hear these ideas that Hayek is articulating in this book. Now, Friedrich Hayek, for those of you guys that don't know, is an Austrian economist. I'm sure everyone listening to this does at this point, but if you don't, he's a very famous Austrian economist. I believe he won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1974, even though we know that there are plenty of horrible people that win the Nobel Prize all the time, like Barack Obama famously winning the Nobel Peace Prize, even though he drone bombed thousands of children. That's beside the point. He was still a brilliant economist and one of the big three Austrian economists of his time. Those other two, of course, being Murray Rothbard and the great Ludwig von Mises. And I believe that Hayek was either a student of Mises or was a good friend of him. They had a personal relationship, and he writes a lot about the problems of totalitarianism. His greatest and possibly most famous book is The Road to Serfdom, one that has been very influential to me. I've read a lot of excerpts from The Road to Serfdom on this show before, but this book, The Counter-Revolution of Science, is F.A. Hayek at his absolute peak. It was just a brilliant work of philosophical history, trying to trace the origins of ideas that have shaped the modern world for the worse. And so if you want to know where all these horrible ideas about totalitarianism and socialism came from, this is the book that explores the origins of those ideas. So it's a really, really interesting book. And the main argument that F.A. Hayek is going to promote in this book, his thesis, is that in the early 19th century, the language and the method of science was illegitimately applied to the study of society. And that led to this conception by scholars and academics and politicians that studied society, that society operated along laws of nature in the same way that natural phenomena that are explored by scientists operate. And Hayek is going to argue that not only is that methodologically inappropriate, but it also leads to the rise of the planned society, this idea that a small group of central planners could organize society, which has led to nothing but death and destruction and devastation for the last 200 years. So very powerful argument here. Now, I do want to read, I guess before we get started, there are just a couple of other things that I have to say here too. Like I said at the beginning, this episode might not be for everyone. It's going to be very dense. So hopefully wherever you're at, you got your mind turned on, you're ready to go. There's a lot of content that we are going to talk about here. And Hayek breaks this work up, The Counter-Revolution of Science, into two pieces. The first part of this work is it's a philosophy of science as it's applied to society and economics and politics. And so he tries to break down a lot of these the philosophical presuppositions of socialism. He tries to break those down philosophically, and then he goes into a history of how these ideas were developed. But he even says in the introduction to the book that might not have been the best way to organize them. So today I'm going to flip the way that it is presented in the book, and I'm going to talk about the history of how these ideas were developed and then talk about the philosophical consequences of those ideas, because I think that's going to be a little bit easier for you guys to understand. It's certainly what I think would have helped me if I'd have read the book in reverse order. The other thing that I want to say, and I'm going to put a link to this in the show notes today, is that there are a lot of arguments in here that are very similar to the arguments that Thomas Kuhn makes in The Structures of Scientific Revolution, and I recorded an episode on that early on in this podcast history, so I'll put a link to that. The really interesting thing is that Thomas Kuhn wrote his groundbreaking and I think like landmark work on the structures of scientific revolution in 1962. F.A. Hayek has a lot of ideas that are fully developed in Kuhn's work, but he wrote The Counter-Revolution of Science in 1952. So a lot of Hayek's ideas predate Kuhn's ideas ideas by 10 years. So I really do think that Hayek was pushing up against something that was incredibly true and incredibly insightful for his time. And we're going to break all of these ideas down on the show today. So I'm going to start out, this is probably going to be the only section of the book that I'm actually going to read, but I want to start out by reading his Hayek's own introduction to the topic that he's going to be covering. And so he says this early on in The Counter-Revolution of Science. He says, during the first half of the 19th century, a new attitude made its appearance. The term science came more and more to be confined to the physical and biological disciplines, which at the same time began to claim for themselves a special rigorousness and certainty which distinguishes them from all others. Their success was such that they soon came to exercise an extraordinary fascination on those working in other fields who rapidly began to imitate their teaching and vocabulary. Thus, the tyranny commenced which the methods and techniques of the sciences in the narrow sense of the term have ever since exercised over other subjects. These became increasingly concerned to vindicate their equal status by showing that their methods were the same as those of their brilliantly successful sisters, rather than by adopting their methods more and more to their own particular problems. And although in the 120 years or so during which this ambition to imitate science in its methods rather than in its spirit has now dominated social studies, it has contributed scarcely anything to our understanding of social phenomenon. Not only does it continue to confuse and discredit the work of the social disciplines, but demands for further attempts in this direction are still presented to us as the latest revolutionary innovation, which, if adopted, will secure rapid, undreamed progress. And this is one of the big ideas that Hayek presents, really the central theme in his book, is that science was so successful in the 18th and early 19th century that people believed that the methods of science could be applied to other disciplines. The problem is that every discipline has its own unique problems. And so the methods of science don't work when you're studying human beings or studying economics or anything like that. Sure, the scientific method does, having some sort of method of analysis and verification and all of those kinds of things. But the fact remains is that the social studies does not operate like phenomenon which take place in the natural world and are predictable and repeatable. People just don't work that way. And what Hayek is going to argue here is that in the early part of the 18th century, there is going to be a large handful of mostly French, at least in its inception, of mostly French academics that believed that you could apply the method of science and the language of science to the study of social phenomenon with the goal of observing the social sphere and being able to discern laws that necessarily direct the course of history in the same way that you might discover the law of gravity and other laws of nature, because in nature there are events that are repeatable and there are certain natural causes that make those phenomenon in nature happen. They believe that you could apply that same kind of methodology to human beings. And Hayek is going to argue very convincingly that that's not true, and it's not even really a good understanding of the scientific method, which Kuhn is going to destroy in 1962, 10 years after this book is written. And so this is his big point. And he goes on to say that, like, as these ideas take hold, we see the rise of socialism and totalitarianism and all of these horrible big government programs. All of these are done with the idea that if governments and politicians and academics apply the scientific method and in a very narrow sense, a very narrow interpretation of the scientific method to the problems of society, that they can somehow solve all of our social problems and plan out a world in which all of our problems are fixed and in which there is peace and prosperity for all. And Hayek is going to argue that that's just not possible. So we're going to dive into the history of this, and I will say that this starts in France, and I know that I am a history teacher by profession, but I do not speak French. And so I know, and I know that there are some people in France. I get a few downloads every episode from people in France. I don't know who you are, but I really appreciate you listening. I am really sorry. I'm really sorry if I make a lot of mistakes in my pronunciation of these French names. Please forgive me. The only language that I speak is English, and I can't help the fact that I'm not proficient in French. So I apologize for that ahead of time. But here is Hayek's argument. How do we get to the point where almost everyone in society accepts the fact that there has to be some sort of centralized direction, either of the economy or of society as a whole or of human relations? Because if you look at the United States States right now, and if you look at the way that people talk about politics, it doesn't matter if you're a conservative or if you're a progressive, there's just this belief that we need these big government organizations and these big government bureaucracies to coordinate human activity. It's just a fundamental presupposition, and no matter how many times these big government bureaucracies and organizations mess up and make mistakes, we still continue to put our trust in them as if they're someday going to get it right. So where does this idea come from? This idea that we can study human beings and study economics and study history in the same way that scientists study the natural world. Well, this is where Hayek is going to go into his historical analysis of the development of these ideas in the counter-revolution of science. And he says this. So you have the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment happens in the 17th and 18th centuries, a dramatically profound period of human change based on reason and based on logic and based on, Newtonian science. So there were all of these, in a lot of ways, the Enlightenment is a culmination of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution. All of these ideas kind of come to their head in the Enlightenment, and it's out of the Enlightenment that the modern world that we live in today will emerge. And the absolute center of the Enlightenment was France, and there's no denying it. I know that there are a lot of Christians that hate the Enlightenment. Those same Christians love the internet and electricity and refrigerators and cars, all of those things that would not have been possible if it wasn't for the Enlightenment. So we shouldn't be so hard on them just because they said some negative things about God. But the Enlightenment was responsible for major scientific breakthroughs. And during this time, the center of the Enlightenment was France. And so with the Enlightenment, there's going to be this belief, because the Enlightenment really is all about the application of reason and the application of science to these problems. And it is through the use of human reason and through the use of this Baconian, Newtonian scientific method that they were able to generate so many technological and so many intellectual breakthroughs during this time period. So it generated this belief among people in what is inevitable progress. So this idea emerges among these Enlightenment thinkers that if reason and science could be applied to all areas of life, then we will be able to make genuine human progress in the same way that we were able to progress technologically and in terms of our understanding of the natural world through reason and science. So really, the main worldview that is generated by the Enlightenment, or the three main ideas of the Enlightenment, are the belief in the absolute hegemony and kind of the objective goodness of science and reason, and then that these two together will generate necessary progress, that human beings will be able to make everything better. And people are going to begin to believe that there might even be a possibility that we could not just solve many of our problems, but that we could solve all of our problems, including problems that are as big as death. And so there's a very famous French philosopher named Condorcet, who was a victim of the French Revolution. I think his story is actually pretty interesting. He was, I think, fleeing Paris, and he was kind of an aristocrat, and he stopped at an inn and he ordered 12 eggs. And so the revolutionaries, I think the Jacobins, they were able to find him because only aristocrats ordered that many eggs, and then they had him killed. But he was truly a brilliant person. He was a mathematician, and he believed that mathematical and scientific principles could be applied to all aspects of society. And so Condorcet is going to give this speech in 1783 before the French Revolution, where he says that we should use the scientific method and mathematical principles to understand human beings, because sure, like the scientific method and mathematics has solved all of these problems of nature, why can't they solve all of our human problems as well? And so it's really with Condorcet and other thinkers like him that this idea that scientific principles could be applied to society is generated. So Condorcet, according to Hayek, is the foundation of both positivism, which is this idea, positivism is this philosophy that says that the only legitimate knowledge that we can have is knowledge that can be empirically proven. And of course, this is going to lead to scientism, which is just another application of positivism. Scientism is the idea that you can apply scientific principles and the method of the scientific enterprise to all areas of society, and that is the only way to produce legitimate knowledge. So there's no place in this schema for subjective knowledge. There's no place for theological knowledge or emotional knowledge or any of that. The only legitimate knowledge is knowledge that can be derived from the methods of science. And of course, also the foundation of socialism. And again, Socialism is, at the end of the day, the idea that the economy needs to be centrally planned and coordinated. And so Condorcet, the consequences of Condorcet's ideas is that if you take these scientific methods and these scientific principles and you apply them to economics, then why couldn't we figure out, in the same way that we discovered how all the planets were held together by gravity, why couldn't we figure out universal economic laws that allow us to direct and guide production and consumption in a completely optimal way? So it's with Condorcet in 1783 and other thinkers that are like him that the idea that scientific principles can and should be applied to every aspect of society, and this is going to generate both positivism and its cousin scientism, and then also the foundations of socialism. Now, before this time, when Condorcet makes this speech, what it meant to be educated in Europe is that you had a classical education. So you would be educated in rhetoric, you would be educated in Greek and Latin, you would be educated in history and in philosophy, as well as mathematics and science and those kinds of things as well. And that was what it meant to be a truly educated person. And when you went to a university, especially in France, you would learn about all of these different subjects because all of them were considered to be a truly educated person. But then we have the French Revolution, which lasts between 1789 and 1799, and this is going to destroy almost all of the academic institutions in France. So before the French Revolution, everyone that got an education, which granted was not that very many people at that time, but everyone that was able to receive an education got this well-rounded classical education where they received training in the humanities and all kinds of different subjects area. They were holistically educated. But during the French Revolution, all of those academic institutions were completely destroyed. And education during this time would focus more on technical skills. So there's not going to be, during the French Revolution, within French education, and you got to remember that that's the center of the European Enlightenment, there's not going to be as much of an emphasis on the humanities because these people believe that that science and scientism are going to be the only way that we can solve all of society's problems. And so this is going to lead to the development of what is called the technical school. So people would go to a school of higher learning, and they might get a little bit of history and they might get a little bit of economics, but they're going to focus on learning a technical skill or a specific science. And so it's during the French Revolution that education is going to be redefined, at least for a time, as somebody who has a technical skill with a minimal knowledge of history and philosophy. And so this is going to lead to this idea within France that will eventually seep out into the rest of Europe, that an educated person doesn't need to necessarily be educated in the humanities. They need to be a scientist. They need to be a world-class scientist. And this is also going to produce, the French Revolution is, a whole generation of academics that don't have any real deep knowledge of the humanities or of history or economics or philosophy. Instead, they are all scientists that believe in this idea that was promoted by Condorcet, that if only they apply their technical skills to the problems of society, that they will be able to fix all of the problems that plague us as human beings. And this is going to lead to the development of what during that time was called ideology in France. And what ideology was rather at that time is the study of man without any sort of biases. So it's going to lead to advances in natural science, and then the belief that the advances in physical sciences are applicable to the social sciences. So you can study society in the same way that these technicians at these technical schools would study any sort of other, engineering or any other sort of scientific technical field. So Napoleon Bonaparte, when he becomes the emperor of France after the French Revolution, he is only going to focus on this technical education because for him, empire building didn't really require deep knowledge of the classics and the humanities and all of those things. Empire building relied on those with technological and scientific knowledge. And Hayek is going to say that because of this, there is an entire generation of classically educated students that was completely lost in France. And it's during this time period, during the Napoleon period, that we see the rise for the first time of both socialism and positivism, scientism, whatever you want to call that, the idea that the only real knowledge is knowledge that's based on empirical evidence and empirical research. And it's this that is the catalyst for the foundation of totalitarianism as we see it today. Now, the man who is responsible for promoting this idea more than any other in France, and the man that before I had read this book I had never heard of, who is actually behind the development a lot of these ideas, is a man named Henri de Saint-Simon. I think is how you pronounce that in French. So Saint-Simon, and he lives from 1760 to 1825, and he is going to be, I think, one of the most important people in modern history that I had never heard of until a couple of weeks ago when I read this book. So Henri de Saint-Simon is a very wealthy French aristocrat, and he spends most of his life traveling and hanging out with very fancy people and doing all kinds of really great things. He did not have a traditional education, neither a classical education or a technical education, and he had very little scientific study. Now, during the French Revolution, he is going to be placed in prison during the Terror, and it's during this time that he is going to commit himself to studying philosophy and thinking about how to best reorganize society, because that was kind of the mood in the air during the French Revolution. And a lot of people don't understand that the American and the French Revolution are both byproducts of the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution relies much heavier on this idea that we can use science and the intellect to reorganize society. And so Henri de Saint-Simon is just breathing that air at that time. And so as he's sitting in this prison cell, he is going to begin thinking about how to reorganize society. And when the revolution is over, he is going to surround himself with intellectuals. And the intellectuals that are available to him at the time are not people that are classically educated in the way that they might have been before the French Revolution. They are people that are going to be technicists. They're ones that went to the technical schools, that learned a particular science, and that might have a very deep knowledge in one particular scientific discipline or one specific scientific aspect of knowledge, but they don't have a deep knowledge in history, philosophy, economics, or any of those things. So he surrounds himself with these people, and then he begins to publish works of literature that will become very important for the development of these socialist and scientist ideas. So in 1803, he publishes, and I'm abbreviating the names of all of his book. Here's the thing about Friedrich Hayek. He's like a lot, and there are a lot of biblical scholars that are like this too, by the way, but Friedrich Hayek fluently spoke multiple languages, and a lot of the names for these French books are written in the original French, and like the footnotes that he provides are also in original French. So some of these might not be the exact names of these works that were originally written, but I'm using my best English approximation of the titles of these works. So if you want to call me on that, if you know French, please reach out to me and give me the proper names of these. But in 1803, he publishes a series of letters, and in it, he proposes a revival of the cult of Newton. And essentially what Saint-Simon is going to argue here is that Newton's scientific method should replace all theology and philosophy. Again, he had surrounded himself with people that had not been trained in theology or philosophy, and so he didn't think that it was important. He believes that all of reality could be understood using the scientific method. And he's going to say that before science can organize society, society has to be reorganized by these scientific ideas. And he's going to develop this concept over the next 10 years or so. And essentially the point that he's going to make here is that society is not ready to be governed by scientific principles. And so the only way that you can get society on board with restructuring everything based on science and reason and the inevitable doctrine of progress is if you can completely restructure society. You have to change the way that people think about this. And so he believes that religion is a very, very bad way of understanding reality, and it offers very little by way of truth because it can't be proven empirically. Again, that goes back to that positive thing. And so he essentially believes, he comes up with this schema of history where history is divided up into three periods vis-a-vis religion. You have the period of polytheism, which characterizes the ancient world. You have the period of deism, which characterizes like the Christian Middle Ages, and then you have the period of physicalism, which is the last great stage of human history in which everyone will embrace all of these grand ideas. And so at its heart, there is this belief that history has this inevitable flow, this inevitable progress, that history operates based on laws in the same way that gravity and other phenomena in nature operate on laws, and that we have to make it to the last great stage. And the only way that you can do that is if you forcefully reorganize society. And he's arguing at the same time for both positivism and for socialism. And so the only way that you can possibly achieve a world in which that happens is if society is completely restructured to embrace it. And so inherently, these ideas are deeply authoritarian. Now, in 1813, Saint-Simon is going to write another book named The Memoir, and this is where he's going to more fully articulate his idea that history develops in stages and that we can somehow step outside of those stages and understand them from the outside. So again, in the same way that we can observe phenomenon in nature and come to the conclusion that there must be some sort of natural law that is behind all of these various phenomenon that appear to be similar, we can do the exact same thing with history. And he believes that all morals and all politics must be subjected to this positive science, that we have to be able to ruthlessly interrogate every aspect of humanity based on this positivism, based on the idea that everything must be subjected to empirical study. And he's going to even come up with the idea that if we truly lean into these theories, like if we truly try to apply these theories, that we could get to the point where we might even be able to step outside of history and learn to control it. And so he is definitely going to have, Saint-Simon is definitely going to have this idea that history is objective, that history can be observed, that there are forces that are at work behind human history that are drawing it towards a certain conclusion, and we have to try to be detached and calculated, just like a scientist would be when he was studying something in a lab, in order to observe history and also direct it in the way that it ought to go. Now, Saint-Simon, as Hayek is going to explain in his book, is a very polarizing figure. And of course, anyone that believes that they have the cognitive ability to step outside of their biases and to step outside of their subjectivity and examine the grand sweep of history and to discern these massive laws of historical development, you have to be a pretty arrogant person to assert that you can do that. And that's a point that Hayek makes over and over again in his book. And he makes this exact same point in The Structures of Scientific Revolution, that it takes a certain level of arrogance to believe that you and your ideas should be the foundation for a complete restructuring of society. But again, Saint-Simon was born and raised in this culture where people genuinely did believe that science had done so much good that if we could only apply it to every other aspect of reality, we could truly turn the world into this place of perfection. But Saint-Simon is very passionate, and he's going to alienate a lot of people. But he does draw also a lot of very intelligent people into his inner circle. And one of those people is Auguste Comte. And Comte in 1817 is going to become Saint-Simon's secretary, and he is going to agree with Saint-Simon that there must be some sort of a physics to society, that there has to be laws that undergird society, and we have to be able to discern those laws and then impose them on the people for everyone's betterment. So Auguste Comte is going to argue along with Saint-Simon that liberty must be a threat to that process. Now, here's the way that this works. Again, if science is like the natural, or I'm sorry, not if science, but if society is like the natural world and it operates on a series of laws, then human liberty will often contradict those natural laws, and that will draw humanity into regression. And so the only way that you can possibly arrive at that bright new future is by understanding the laws that control historical development and that control human interactions and that control society, and then force people to accept them. If people have liberty, that will be a threat to that stability, and it will be a threat to that order, and it will ultimately be a threat to human progress. So you can't have freedom because of because of the reality of these scientific laws that undergird all of society. So Saint-Simon and Comte are going to work on this journal beginning in 1819, and the journal is going to be called Organisateur or something like that. I'm I'm assuming it means the organizer, because again, their entire idea is we understand now because of scientism these laws that govern human interactions and that govern history and that govern economics. And so we have to reorganize society to better fit within those laws. And they really come up with and develop the idea that this Enlightenment doctrine of progress, the idea that science and reason will make the world a better place, is not just true in the abstract sense that like better technology will make us live longer lives and make us healthier, but they begin to believe that progress is a meta-historical force, that it is something that operates outside of the bounds of history. It's almost like a god in a sense, that progress is the force behind history that is directing it to a certain logical end, that progress is like a scientific law. It's like gravity. There's nothing that you can do to escape it. It's just something that exists as an objective fact. And that they come to the conclusion that since political systems direct society, in order to harness progress, this great meta-historical force, you have to have political systems that are based on these laws. And so all of this is going to focus on society, and they believe that every aspect of society, artwork and education, all of it should direct us towards this progress, and that all previous forms of knowledge, whether it be theology or whether it be any philosophy that wasn't positivistic or whether it be our own subjective emotional experiences, all forms of those knowledge have to be eliminated if we are going to arrive at the proper conclusion of history. If history is operating on a principle, on a series, on a set of principles, on a set of laws, then the only way that we can get to that point is if we are applying through force, if necessary, these laws upon all society. So they're going to, in 1821, come up with another writing called Industrial Systems, where they are going to develop this idea that liberty is an obstacle to a well-ordered society. So you cannot have individuals having freedom because these individuals might have religious beliefs, or these individuals might have subjective emotional preferences that they act on. And you cannot have a society that is fully functional and that reaches the potential of its meta-historical progress if people have liberty. So in the industrial system, they're going to argue that liberty is an obstacle to a well-ordered society and that it must be done away with. And they're also going to make the point that if you take that as an a priori, if human freedom is a threat to society, you also have to find a way to harness the economy, because there must be laws. And these aren't principles like supply and demand and scarcity of choice, or even the Austrian principle of praxeology. These are discernible laws like gravity that can guide all economic production. And so the only way that you can harness the economy for the good of progress is by applying these positivistic principles to them. And so they're going to argue for a form of corporate industrialism. So instead of having all of these small businesses, you must have these massive corporations that are centrally planned, because a centrally planned economy and a massive corporation that has a centrally planned board, all of these people can get the technical economic skills that they need to intellectually and wisely organize their corporations and wisely and scientifically organize all of the economy, and that this is going to result in optimal production. So it can't be that the economy develops because of the, kind of the aggregation of the choices of individual consumers and producers. It can't be that at all. Instead, what it must be is it must be centrally planned based on these laws of history. So again, in the industrial system, 1821, they're going to argue based on the fact that a human society can be organized scientifically, that the best way economically forward is a form of corporate industrialization that is centrally controlled. They're going to continue to develop. I think that Saint-Simon is still going to have a pride of place, but Saint-Simon is going to have a falling out with Comte, and then he's also going to die in 1825. He's going to be in pretty bad health anyways. And so in 1824, we are going to have Comte going out on his own, and he is going to write a very important book called The System of Positive Policy. And Friedrich Hayek is going to say that this book, The System of Positive Policy, is probably the most important important work of all of these that were under the influence of Saint-Simon and this positivistic view of history. So that's called The System of Positive Policy. It was written by Auguste Comte to develop the ideas of Saint-Simon, and it is published in 1824. And he is going to fully articulate what he calls the new science of social physics. So at this point, he has fully taken the social studies and submitted them to the methods and the language, which Hayek will argue are partially misunderstood, of science. And so this new science that he develops is called the science of social physics. And he wants to, by using the science of social physics, he wants to discover all of the natural and unavoidable laws of the progress of civilization. So civilization as a whole in this system of positive policy is going to operate like the law of gravity. He is going to call liberty a monstrosity, and he says the people that believe in liberty are antisocial because they don't want to harness this new social science in order to understand how society ought to best be organized. And he believes that a perfect social order can be achieved, that we as a human species can achieve a perfect social order, but the only way that we can possibly achieve a social order is if every single individual is assigned to the activity for which they are the most fit. And this means that you have to have a group of technicians, just like the people that came out of the technical schools of the French Revolution. You have to have a group of scientists, people that have perfect positivistic knowledge, that have perfect scientific knowledge, organizing all of society and telling people based on their fitness what they have to do with their life. Now, if this is starting to sound a lot like modern socialism or communism, or even for those people that are truly historically minded, it should sound a lot like Nazi Germany as well, because all authoritarianism they're just different branches of the same tree, whether it's Nazism or communism or whatever. It's again, they're all a part of the same basic ideas, but it's this belief that through the application of the scientific method to society that we can plan out the best future. And in fact, liberty is an obstacle to that. We shouldn't want liberty. Liberty is a horrible thing to have. We don't need any of that stuff. Instead, what we need are technicians that can organize society in whatever way they see fit. So Saint-Simon is going to die in 1825, but Comte wants to carry on his ideas. So in 1825 and 1826, Comte is going to gather a lot of Saint-Simon's disciples together, and they are going to start a new work called the Producteur, which is a product to advance these Saint-Simonian ideas. And again, you're already seeing, those of you guys that understand totalitarianism and that understand authoritarianism are already seeing how the very fertile soil for these ideas is being tilled by all of these thinkers at the beginning of the 19th century. So the Producteur is going to bring a lot of people together, and one of those people is going to be Bartholomé Prosper Infantin. He is going to become the editor of this work, the Producteur. Now, he is the product of these technical schools. He is a great technician, and he is going to advance the ideas that humans must achieve destiny and mastery over nature. So again, it's this idea that goes back to the Enlightenment, that if human beings can apply the scientific method, and if they can apply their reason, then they can master everything. They can master nature, they can master society, they can master economics. And he's going to say that all of society has to be directed towards these ends. All artwork needs to point towards this bright new future and serve the scientific purpose, and that technical economics, such as Adam Smith had developed in the previous century, are going to be irrelevant. We don't need any of that economic knowledge, because a true economy is an economy that can be planned along scientific lines. If only we can step outside of our own system and our own standpoint, then we can find these laws that perpetuate the economy ever forward, and we no longer need economics. We can just plan the economy away, and we'll always know exactly what to expect, and we'll always know how to produce exactly the right amount of goods and services. Now, following on with this, there's going to be more works that are done by this group of people. And in 1829 and 1830, a lot of these groups are going to, a lot of these people within this group are going to help publish a book called The Expositions. And this is going to be where all of the doctrines of socialism are going to be outlined by Saint-Simon's followers. And in fact, Hayek is going to call this in his book, The Bible of Socialism. And it's written between 1829 and 1830. And this is where, after 30 years of Saint-Simon promoting these ideas and having people embrace these ideas of being able to objectively understand society and being able to objectively harness the scientific method to direct civilization to a certain logical and necessary conclusion, that these doctrines of socialism are going to be developed. And this is really, really important because in the exposition, we are going to see a lot of ideas that are also going to be present in the works of Karl Marx. And in reality, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself in here, but in reality, we're going to see how the ideas of Saint-Simon are going to collide with the ideas of Karl Marx in Germany and ultimately result in the development of full socialism. But in this exposition, which was written between 1829, we are going to see for the first time the idea that history is developed by natural law, that there are certain stages to history. There's a historical dialectic. It's kind of this Hegelian understanding of the development of history, that there are going to be only two classes of people in society, those that are exploited and those that do the exploiting, which again is a prefiguration of Karl Marx. This comes out of this exposition in 1829 and 1830 in France. That property rights are just an illusion. There's no scientific basis to property rights, and so we don't need them anymore. And then there's also going to be a big apology for central banking, this idea that banks and that currency should be centrally controlled. Because again, if there are scientific laws that undergird every aspect of society, then there must be scientific laws that undergird banking as well. So instead of having a decentralized currency, or instead of allowing people the freedom or the liberty to exchange goods and services using whatever denomination they want, we need central banks to help direct and grow the economy. And all of these ideas are going to be developed in this book. And so we are going to see how these ideas are going to catch on like wildfire throughout Europe after the publication of the exposition. So these Saint-Simonian and Comtean ideas are able to spread very quickly. And one of the reasons for that is that they were incredibly influential in literary and artistic circles during this time. So again, one of the ideas behind this is that if all of human society has to be directed towards the proper end based on positivistic ideas of science, then all artwork should basically more or less reinforce that goal. And so there are a lot of literary and artistic types that were drawn to Saint-Simonian ideas, and they produced books and they produced works of literature and they produced paintings, and that media spread throughout Europe. In the autumn of 1830, there's going to be another revolution in France. It was pretty rough time for the French all in all in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is going to bring, at least in Europe, more attention to intellectual circles in France. And these ideas are going to very quickly spread to Germany. And the ideas of Saint-Simon and Comte are going to make a massive influence in the circles of Hegel in Germany. Now, Hegel was a philosopher. He was born in 1770 and he died in 1831, right around the time that these ideas of Saint-Simon are making their inroads into Germany. But he is known most famously for the historical dialectic that was appropriated by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto. Now, I did an episode on this. I believe it's episode 6. Also post links to this in the show notes. If you haven't heard it, it's actually a pretty good episode. One of my better earlier episodes in my opinion. But I break down the ideas of Marx and Hegel. And essentially, Hegel has this idea that there is, and this is very compatible with the Saint-Simonian, Comtean ideas of historical development. He believes that there are forces that operate outside of history that drive history in a certain direction. And he has this idea of historical dialect where you have the way the history develops itself is that you have opposing forces, a thesis and an antithesis. They come into collision with each other and they produce a synthesis, which drives history forward, and then that synthesis will either become another antithesis or thesis, and it will collide with another idea. So there's this whole process, and Marx draws on those ideas in his Communist Manifesto. It's kind of the foundation for his understanding of the development of history, very much a product of Enlightenment positivism and Enlightenment scientism. So it makes sense that these Saint-Simonian ideas are going to be very popular in Hegelian camps. And so there are a lot of dissimilarities in a lot of ways, and and the one, to be fair, like Hayek is going to express, there are a lot of dissimilarities between Hegel and Saint-Simon, but it's the idea of social positivism, as I said, and then this dialectical method of history that are both going to profoundly influence Marx. So it's very interesting that that Hegel as a philosopher and Saint-Simon and Comte are very different in a lot of ways, but they still have this idea that history is developing objectively and it's headed somewhere, and that we can both understand and to a certain extent harness that. And so it's going to be this, again, combination of these two ideas that will eventually lead to and influence Marx. So a lot of, and another point that Hayek makes too, and he goes through the research in his book, so you can go back and look at this, and I would highly recommend, if you're interested in these philosophical ideas, I would highly recommend doing so. But a lot of Marx's early influences were Saint-Simonians. These were all people that had bought in, the people that were influencing Karl Marx as he was developing intellectually. These were all people that were influenced by Saint-Simon and his ideas. The introduction of Comtean and Saint-Simonian ideas into Germany are completely going to transform German economic ideals. And again, this is going to lead to, within Germany, a direction towards more centralized planning of the economy. So you're going to have leaders like Bismarck in Germany and Napoleon III in France who are going to be in favor of cartels. They're going to be in favor of massive corporations. They're going to be in favor of massive central banks, because all of these, they believed, were going to direct the economy in the most appropriate order. And so you can already see, like, for those of you guys that know American history and understand the progressive era, you can see that a lot of the fundamental ideas of the progressive era are really starting to play out and really starting to be developed during this time period. So as these ideas are spreading into Germany, Comte and all of his successors are going to continue to refine these ideas. Again, the ideas that history can be understood scientifically, that it was possible for a man to step outside of history and observe it from the outside, and then that there are certain stages that human history must go through in order to make it to its intended conclusion. And for those of you guys that have ever read, and if you haven't, you need to. Please read Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. If you read that and Vladimir Lenin's State and Revolution, then communism will make a lot of sense to you. They're just very important readings, and you can see, because the Communist Manifesto was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, published in 1848, and so all of these ideas had already been embedded into the culture of Europe, and there were already a lot of academics that believed, because of their technical training, that science could solve all of our problems, and that science should be applied to the study of all of these other things. There are many people that believe this during this time, and so it makes perfect sense that Marx is able to sum up and articulate all of these ideas, and that it would be widely accepted by people in Europe. Now, there are going to be a lot of differences, as I already said before, between Saint-Simon and then Comte and Hegel, but Hayek is going to explain that there are some very significant overlaps between the two of them, and that instead of looking at how Comte and Hegel diverge, we should try to understand where their ideas converged, or at least their ideas were interpreted as converging by their followers during this time. So both of them, these men, both Comte and Hegel, are going to have a massive influence on social theory. A lot of their ideas about social theory are going to overlap, and they are going to set the social and political discourse throughout the mid-18th century. Again, all of the mainstream political ideals in Europe are going to be a derivation of, or a critique or a commentary of, the ideas of Comte and Hegel. Comte thought very highly of Hegel and thought that Hegel could push a lot of these Saint-Simonian ideas in Germany. They have a very similar social theory. So they believe that the central aim of all study of society must be to construct a universal history of mankind, understood as a necessary development based on predictable laws. So again, both Hegel and Comte believed that you could apply scientism, positivism, you could apply that to history and make it make sense. So instead of history just being kind of a long yet unpredictable development of individual human beings interacting and then producing coherent meaning, you have this idea that there are meta-historical forces that are necessarily pushing history towards an intended destination. Historicism in both of these men are also going to replace the historical method. So instead of trying to analyze text historically, throughout Europe, people are going to be less interested in doing like the actual hard work of history, analyzing primary sources and trying to rigorously understand the difference between the ideas of previous times and the ideas of the modern era. And instead, they're going to replace the historical method with this new historicism. So instead of looking at the development of ideas over time, they're going to try to see how ideas and peoples and events fit into different phases of history. Because again, if history is nothing more than the product of these laws, then we should be able to observe those laws and then control them to arrive at our proper destination. Again, it's a destination. It's scientism applied to history. So both Hegel and Comte are going to produce what is called historicism, which is very popular in the 1840s. Marx and Engels are both going to appropriate the language of Hegel, but they are going to develop their ideas within the thought categories of Comte. And so economists are going to begin writing in these categories, which is going to lead to the progressive era and which will ultimately lead to totalitarianism under the guise of the fact that we can control the destiny of the human race through these ideas. And for those of you guys that have been paying attention for this entire time, and I know that all of you have, if you've made it to the 49-minute mark of this episode, you will be able to immediately see the parallels between our contemporary political discourse and the way that has developed since the progressive era and these ideas that were forged in the fires of early 19th century French thought. Like the parallels are just so clear and easy to understand. And in so many ways, we are still under the sway of these very powerful ideas. The reason why F.A. Hayek titled this book The Counter-Revolution of Science is precisely because the scientific method genuinely did lead to real human flourishing and real human progress. We were able to understand so many aspects of nature that we were not able to understand before. And all of these technological revolutions that have taken place since then are a result of the scientific method. But the point that Thomas Kuhn is going to argue in 1962 in The Structures of Scientific Revolution is that science is very limited. Like it does a very good job of producing data about phenomenon in the natural world, but this doesn't mean that it gives us all of the answers to all of these questions. And in a lot of ways, science is always provisional, and there's always more evidence that could be provided that might overturn previous theories. And Hayek is going to make the exact same point. He says that this belief in objective science and scientism as the only way of understanding the world around us and the only way of understanding the social sciences and everything else, that's just completely illegitimate. That's not only is it not appropriate for history, but he says that science doesn't even operate that way because science isn't really objective. Science is based on the whims of the scientists that are performing the research. And while we might get hard data and while we might come to new and greater conclusions about the natural world, there's nothing, we will never get to the point in history where we're going to be able to wake up one day and just say that we understand everything. That just doesn't exist. It's not a possibility. And that's especially true when you try to apply these ideas to the social sciences. You just can't do it. And so he calls this book The Counter-Revolution of Science because science has done more damage to human civilization, or at least the misapplication of the scientific method to history, economics, theology, and politics has done more damage to the human species than anything else in the last 200 years. And it's no surprise that the 20th century, which obviously chronologically and historically immediately preceded the 19th century, there's no surprise that was the century of total war and nuclear weapons and the most pain and suffering that humanity had ever experienced in its history up to that point. Yes, the 20th century was a time of unprecedented technological development, but it is this misapplication of science to the problems of society that has plagued us ever since Saint-Simon and Comte began promoting those ideas in France. Now, I want to quickly go through the philosophical section of Hayek's work. And this is where we're going to get a little bit more abstract and a little bit more technical. And I know I don't have a lot of time left today, and I want to make sure that I get you guys out of here in an appropriate amount of time because I respect you and I respect the fact that you will listen to a podcast that goes for over an hour long. But he spends a lot of time just explaining why science can't possibly function in the way that Saint-Simon and Comte and then Marx and then all of these social engineers ever since then have possibly thought that science could operate. And so here's what he says, is that science is essentially a rejection of the anthropomorphic conception of nature that we, in science, and this is a very Kuhnian way of understanding science in the way that I understand it. Science is essentially a method that allows us to explore phenomenon that happen in nature. But Thomas Kuhn has this beautiful passage at the end of The Structures of Scientific Revolution where he says that we should not think about science in teleological terms. We shouldn't think that science is going to be able to solve all of our problems. Instead, science just allows us to constantly refine our understanding of the natural world, and that we should also confine our understanding of science to problems in nature, because that's specifically what science as a discipline is designed to address. It can't deal with the philosophical or the theological or even the economic or those kinds of issues, because it's just not the proper methodology for that. You have to have a different set of methodologies to deal with those issues. So Hayek is going to go on, and he's going to say that before the 1800s, all disciplines had methods that were suited to their task of addressing problems. So different disciplines necessarily required different methods. So you had history required one method of analysis and one method of study. Economics requires a different method and a different way of analyzing it. And of course, science has its own method. So every single discipline, regardless of what it is, they're going to have their own methods of study and their own methods of analysis that are unique and suited to addressing those problems. But with the rise of the polytechnic schools in France, all other disciplines were kind of forced to imitate the method and language of science, even when it was even when it was inappropriate. And Hayek's burden in this book is to say that science as those methods and language of science as applied to history and society are wholly inappropriate for the task of actually analyzing those things. So scientism is the mechanical application of thought to fields other than science, and is actually very unscientific because it doesn't allow us to look at evidence and observe reason. Instead, we wind up coming up, like Saint-Simon did, with these meta-historical theories that are then applied without any sort of evidence or any sort of logical backing to them at all. And so with the social sciences, all human beings are deeply subjective, and so social sciences must assume that task. So if you are going to engage in the work of studying society, you have to assume that all human beings are subjective, and all of our data that we have is produced by subjective human beings. All of our primary sources, all of the literature, all the architecture, all of the pottery, the archaeological evidence, all of it is produced by subjective human beings. There's nothing objective at all about the study of history, and so we have to analyze the beliefs and actions of people that are different from us, being aware of our own cultural biases and being aware that a lot of the beliefs and actions of other people might not actually be like intellectually or morally correct. So our data is subjective in the social studies, and so are our ideas and concepts. So there's nothing stable about the study of society in the way that there is with the study of nature. When you go and study a rock, or when you go and study gravity, or when you go and study outer space, there are constants, but that is just not true with the study of human beings. And Hayek is going to argue here that what social sciences should focus on is the study of how individual actions produce social consequences that are often unplanned. And really, that's how history developed. You have all of these people that act as individuals. Those individuals will often come together, and there will be consequences of those choices that are often unintended and completely unpredicted. So you really can't harness the direction of society. And Hayek makes the point that we wouldn't even have gotten to the place where we knew this much about nature had it not been for these unplanned consequences. So the idea that we have to, after the Enlightenment, now plan human society, just completely unnecessary. So he's going to define scientism, which is one of the problems. And scientism is the idea that all human behavior is reducible to physical properties that we can understand, like we understand phenomenon in nature. But people operate in ways that can sometimes be rationally understood. But the social studies should reject the idea that the study of society is the same as the study of nature. We can't study people like we study nature, because we have to understand the subjective thought categories of the subjects, which are mediated through our own subjectivity. So there's just no way to step back and do experiments on human beings in the same way that you can do experiences on phenomenon in nature. And in science, you have to work in a lot of ways from the whole to the part. So you have these large theories like the theories of natural laws like gravity that explain individual occurrences in nature, which works within a collective framework. Scientism assumes like collectives like society and capital and things like that have a stable, universally accepted understanding and then categorize all human behavior based on those subjective constructions. But that's not true. Like even concepts like nationhood or society or family or kinship, those ideas have evolved and changed over time. And it's the task of the historian to try to understand why people had different conceptions of those ideas throughout history, not assume that something such as society exists as a constant stable and then apply that back into people in history anachronistically. We just cannot do that. History and theory are both very much necessary to understand social phenomenon, Hayek is going to argue, but they are not the same. Historicism is scientism, and it's the method and language of objective science that is applied to history. And this is going to completely ignore the methodological extinction between theory and history, which we both must have. And again, Hayek is going to argue for what he calls the composite theory to sum this all up. And this is the idea that the independent action of many men can produce coherent wholes. This is going to mean that purpose cannot be centrally planned based on any laws of society, but we have to just allow individuals to coordinate in ways that make sense to them as individuals, and that will ultimately produce the kinds of outcomes that are going to be advantageous, but most likely completely unplanned. And Hayek is here also going to reject any sort of teleological conception of history. There's no definite end towards which we're all heading. We just have to allow human beings to freely cooperate, to freely make decisions on their own, and that is going to be the most optimal system of structuring society that we can come up with. You cannot plan that. You cannot coerce it. You can't do anything to direct it because there are no laws that backstop history. There's just the unplanned and unforeseen consequences of human action. All right, we covered a lot of ground on the show today. I know that was incredibly dense and incredibly complicated, but I think that if you've been listening along this entire time, you can definitely see how all of these ideas, these scientific ideas, these scientistic positivistic ideas are still undergirding a lot of the popular discourse around politics and around economics in our society today. And there are a lot of people that are basically like they're political post-millennialists. They believe that we can establish this kind of perfect kingdom of God on earth. And I just don't think that that's true. And I think that F.A. Hayek does such a great job of examining both the roots of these ideas and also how he's doing the great work that every historian needs to do. Also how these the ideas of Saint-Simon and Comte and Hegel and Marx, all of them were influenced by their historical context. Like all of them were influenced by the world in which they were living. And so to that extent, their ideas are completely understandable historically, but then we can also see how they're also deeply flawed, that they were just way too optimistic about the ability for science to solve all of our problems. And at the end of the day, libertarianism is a rejection of the idea that we could possibly have enough knowledge as human beings to centrally plan out a society. And you guys, those of you guys that have been longtime listeners to the show, know that I'm very sympathetic towards certain postmodern ideas about epistemology, and I'm very skeptical about the ability for human beings to objectively know anything. And I feel that human beings are actually a lot more subjective and biased than we all often claim to believe. And I also see, as I look around me, this myth that was very obvious during the COVID pandemic that people still have about science, that somehow invoking the name of science means that you are getting the objective truth. But that's just not true. And we can see from the long vantage point of history that over the last 200 years, there has been this massive push among intellectuals and the political class and even the business class, because it benefits them financially, to want to organize all of society around this misapplication of scientific ideas to the social sciences. And we have seen the disastrous results of that. Again, 2 world wars in the 20th century, nonstop combat, more weapons, nuclear weapons. there are all kinds of things that have resulted from this scientific way of pursuing society that have not been good or productive for the human race. And I think that the only way that we're ever going to be able to solve this problem is if we are able to say that science has to stay in its own lane and only focus on observing and describing phenomenon that take place in nature, which it is uniquely good at doing. I'm not trying at all to take away from the contributions of science to the human race. I'm not trying to do that at all. I'm just saying that science is a perfect method for studying nature and a very imperfect method for studying other aspects of society. And as a social studies teacher who every day, as a middle school social studies teacher, I can only do this to a certain extent, but every day I try to help my students understand how to think historically. You don't think historically in the same way that you think scientifically. Yes, the scientific method of looking at evidence and trying to come to conclusions is very much appropriate, but all of the scientific or the scientistic ways of thinking are just not. So I hope that you guys were able to get a lot out of this episode today. This is a really, really important book, and I hope that my very brief foray through these ideas did it justice. I know that there's so much depth and so much learning in this book, and I just tried to present you guys with the big picture so that you could see the origins of a lot of very popular political ideas in the 21st century and where they come from. I would highly recommend it. Even though this book is at this point 70 years old, it's just as fresh, just as relevant today as it was when it was written. Thank you guys so much for listening to the end of an hour-long episode on a very technical work of philosophical history, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys back next Tuesday. Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.